Rarely in United States history has the nation been vulnerable to a military takeover. But toward the end of the Revolutionary War, a group of disgruntled officers came together at the Army's winter quarters in Newburgh, New York.
The officers had not been paid, which was chronic throughout the war. And now, clearly the war is ending, and the officers, many of them are afraid. Congress will say, fine, thank you, go home. You know, it was nice to have you fighting for us, but still not pay them.
The officers spread an anonymous appeal throughout the camp.
And it said, more or less, if this is how you were treated when you still have your swords, how will you be treated when you give them up? If we want what we're owed, what we deserve, we have to act now. We have to threaten Congress now.
A secret meeting was called. General George Washington, who had learned of the plan, had not said whether he would attend, but on the appointed day, he strode into the chapel where the men had gathered and took the chair.
Then Washington reads an appeal to his officers, and he says that if they respond to the notion of threatening Congress, if they do that, they will throw away everything they've been fighting for 8.5 years.
Can he be a friend to the army? Can he be a friend to his country? Rather, is he not an insidious foe, plotting the ruin of both by sowing the seeds of discord and separation between the civil and military powers of the continent?
Now, at the end of this speech, which is a very good one, very moving one, he says he wants to read them a letter from Congress to show that Congress is thinking about their problems. So he wants to read this letter. He pauses, he sort of fumbles with the letter, and then he takes out from his pocket a pair of reading glasses. And he puts the glasses on, and he says, "Gentlemen,
you must pardon me. I have grown gray in your service, and now find myself growing blind."
The officers are in tears. He finishes the letter. You know, he knows you don't step on a line like that. He just leaves the room. Everybody votes unanimously to do whatever he wants, and that is the end of the potential Newburgh mutiny.
But the anxiety that led the officers to conspire at Newburgh would not dissipate as readily as the conspiracy itself. In the mid-1780s, as the euphoria of victory subsided, the instability of the new nation was exposed.
Our affairs seem to lead to some crisis, some revolution, something I cannot foresee or conjecture. I'm uneasy and apprehensive, more so than during the war.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union.
I think too often we assume that the United States had always been united. From the period of the Declaration of Independence, if not earlier, we had been united in opposition to Britain, in opposition to the other enemies of the American Republic, that we'd always been united, but actually it's just the opposite.
Without the all-consuming mission of war to hold the country together, regional and ideological differences resurfaced. The Congress, trying to govern under the Articles of Confederation, was largely ineffectual.
The whole theory of confederation is that the Congress would propose what the states ought to do, and I emphasize the ought. But Congress had no mechanism, or actually no authority or mechanism to enforce its resolutions, its recommendations, its requisitions for supplies and for taxation. So there's a basic problem of enforcement under the Articles of Confederation. I mean, the states, I think, were trying as hard as they could, but they had problems of their own, and it came to be perceived that a union that relied always on the voluntary goodwill of the states could not really last very long or function very effectively.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice.
With 13 different political entities making laws, a whole new set of legal concerns began to proliferate. If all the states were sovereign, who had the authority to arbitrate in quarrels between the states? Conflicts over matters of trade, commerce, monetary policy, and borders were straining interstate allegiances.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility.
In the fall of 1786, a group of armed farmers marched on some of the county courthouses in western Massachusetts. Led by a former Army officer, Daniel Shays, they were protesting excessive taxes imposed by the state legislature.
Madison, who is often considered the father of the Constitution, was not only concerned about the weakness, what he called the imbecility of the Confederation, but he was concerned about the power of majorities in the state legislatures and the way in which they were creating injustice and creating problems within the states. And for him, Shays' Rebellion confirmed his feeling that if Massachusetts couldn't solve its problems, then what state could?
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense.
Despite the promise of being bound to one another to come to one another's aid should attacks occur, in spite of the promise or pledging themselves to providing for the cost of this kind of defense through a common treasury, none of that was forthcoming when the Shays' Rebellion took place. In the end, Massachusetts pretty much had to raise the money on its own to put down the rebellion.
Providing for the common defense was not a minor concern in the United States in the 1780s. Ongoing conflict with Indian peoples on the frontier, combined with the continuing military presence of Britain and Spain on the continent, posed a constant threat to the security of the young nation.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare.
Perhaps the biggest threat to national security during this time was economic in nature. The 1780s was a time of financial turbulence.
Part of the Depression is due simply to demobilization, a lessening of demand for supplies and services as a result of the end of the War of Independence. But also the Depression, the economic depression, was due to actions taken by Great Britain, closing off, for example, much of the trade to the British West Indies, which had been important for the American colonies.
Many British merchants also refused to extend credit, making it virtually impossible for American merchants to conduct business overseas.
And one way of responding, obviously, would be that if Britain has restricted our access to certain markets, then we should retaliate. I mean, if they place duties on our goods, shouldn't we place duties on their goods?
But under the Articles of Confederation, Congress had no power to establish a uniform trade policy. Therefore, any state could and did pursue its own self-interest at the expense of the other states.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity.
In the minds of the Founding Fathers, the way to secure the blessings of liberty for the future was to gain control over the Northwest Territory and develop procedures for settling those lands.
The Northwest Ordinance provided the means for establishing a way of governing the territories. Once you achieve the status of 60,000 inhabitants and apply for statehood and are admitted, you're a full participating member equal to the original 13, which is important. So one major accomplishment is doing all of this in terms of political tutelage towards equality. The second is that the Northwest Ordinance prohibited slavery from those territories. in the Old Northwest.
The Northwest Ordinance was one area in which Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, was able to be effective. Still, many leaders of the new nation agreed that the Articles were insufficient and needed to be revised. Among these, a smaller group including George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison believed that more drastic measures were necessary, and they began quietly to push for a reconceptualization of the entire federal government. In the summer of 1787, the Constitutional Convention got underway in the same room in Philadelphia where many of the same men had signed the Declaration of Independence. Their passionate debate took place under a shroud of secrecy. Even the windows were covered and sealed to ensure privacy, despite the intense heat.
They would keep it private so that members would be free to speak their own minds without fear of any sort of retribution. And by keeping it private, the public outside would not be continuously assembling to protest or come out in support of certain actions that were being debated in the halls of the convention.
For James Madison, the vow of silence was a function of the magnitude of the event. Madison was the first delegate to arrive in Philadelphia, and he quickly took his place at the center of the drama. Although he was only 35 years old, Madison had been preparing for this moment for a long time.
I think he understands or has come to believe that there really is a deep crisis of the Union that requires a kind of comprehensive resolution. We know that he'd worked his way through a couple of trunkloads or more of books that Jefferson had shipped him from Paris, where he goes through a number of classic works and tries to figure out what had gone wrong with this confederation or that confederation, and to try to draw some conclusions on that. So Madison was the kind of politician who understood that most of his colleagues in any legislative assembly were likely to be lazier and less energetic and probably less farsighted than he was. And I think Madison understood that the importance of what we now call agenda control, or the ability to kind of shape an agenda from the outset. And so that's why I think he goes into the convention exceptionally well prepared in terms of all the issues that he thought needed to be canvassed.
The great difficulty lies in the affair of representation. And if this could be adjusted, all others would be surmountable.
The people should have as little to do as may be about the government. They lack information and are constantly liable to be misled.
The popular election of one branch of the national legislature is essential to every plan of free government.
There are two sort of huge issues dealing with representation which lead to two grand compromises in the convention. The first deals with large and small states, specifically how these states would be represented in the new legislature, to which they were going to give enormous powers. The small states wanted the procedure that had been used in the Articles of Confederation to persist, and that is each state gets an equal vote regardless of size. The large states thought this was unfair. I mean, how could it be that if you had 500,000 inhabitants, you would have the same clout as Delaware with 50-some-odd thousand inhabitants?
The proceedings soon bogged down in seemingly irreconcilable differences.
Their ideas are so different, their prejudices so strong and so various, and their particular interests seeming so opposite that not a move can be made that is not contested.
Differences over representation were finally resolved by the Great Compromise. Each state would have an equal number of votes in the Senate, while in the House, members would be apportioned by population. Meanwhile, the delegates had come to another, more ominous agreement. The so-called 3/5 compromise allowed that slaves be counted as 3/5 of a person when calculating population for representation.
I think it has to be understood as a sectional compromise, and it's offensive to us for lots of reasons. But the alternative that you have to think about is if the South doesn't get some additional benefit or some kind of coefficient to increase its representation, why should it stay in the Union? That's the issue here. If you want to have a union, and the South is demanding, or Southern delegates are saying, precisely because we're going to be in a minority, and we know that anti-slavery sentiment is already growing in the North, we would be nuts to come into this arrangement if we don't have some means of protecting ourselves. So that's kind of the ugly truth about it.
Religion and humanity have nothing to do with this question. Interest alone is the governing principle with nations.
Once the deadlock was broken, the work proceeded at a brisker pace, and the structure of the new government began to take shape.
The most important change the framers made really comes right out of Madison's analysis of what's wrong with the Confederation, which is you can't have a Confederation that's going to rely on the states to carry out national policy. You need a national government that's going to be able to enact, execute, and adjudicate its own laws. You need the whole array of institutions that Americans then thought of as being the full expression of what a government ought to be. So that means a legislature divided bicamerally with two houses. You need an independent executive, and I guess equally interestingly, you need some kind of an independent judiciary. I think the framers understood the judiciary would be the institution most responsible for mediating or working out conflicts in those areas where national government and state government or national law and state law overlapped or came into conflict or were somehow in tension with each other.
When the delegates finished their work in September, they agreed to preserve the secrecy of their debates. But Madison carefully saved his notes, letters, and memos, and his papers form the basis of much of what we know about the creation of the Constitution.
He did want people to know how the deliberations had unfolded, and I think that was because he himself had tried to figure out what had happened in the formation of previous governments, and he couldn't come up with a coherent story. We don't really know how most nations began. So I think Madison was very sensitive to the needs of historians like myself. I mean, I owe him a lot. We all owe him something as citizens, but I owe him a lot, I suppose, as a historian.
Everything now depends on the incalculable fluctuation of human passions. We'll know in several months whether it is yes or no.
In order for the Constitution to become the law of the land, 9 out of 13 states had to ratify it. In 1787, this was hardly a foregone conclusion.
The Anti-Federalists were frightened about this new government usurping, taking away power from the states, quite understandably, because the Constitution explicitly forbade the states from exercising a number of powers. It could no longer levy tariffs. The states could not print money. They also feared the power of the presidency. They felt that this was a quasi-monarchical office that would become like a king, and elected king, no doubt, but a king nonetheless.
By the spring of 1788, 8 states had ratified, some with the explicit understanding that a Bill of Rights would be added. Meanwhile, the powerful states of Virginia and New York were holding out. Without their support, the new Constitution was not likely to survive, and the opposition was fierce.
These lawyers and men of learning and moneyed men that talk so finely and gloss over matters so smoothly to make us poor illiterate people swallow down the pill, expect to get into Congress themselves. They expect to be the managers of this Constitution and get all the power and the money into their own hands. And then they will swallow up all us little folks, like the great Leviathan.
A series of essays began appearing in New York newspapers, arguing eloquently that the Constitution was the best guarantee of the future welfare of the United States.
Federalist Papers were 85 papers written in New York by mostly Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, designed to convince New Yorkers to ratify the Constitution.
In the extended Republic of the United States, and among the great variety of interests, parties, and sects which it embraces, a coalition of a majority of the whole society could seldom take place on any other principles than those of justice and the general good.
They were very polemical pieces in the sense they're kind of propaganda for the Constitution, but they've taken on an immense importance that really much more important than they were at the time.
Although they were writing for an immediate audience, I think they did have one eye half-cocked on later generations. But the fact that it's so systematic and comprehensive and that some of the essays are so nuanced and so learned means that we have to be a little bit suspicious as to how well, or a little bit doubtful, as to how well it really represented what people were thinking at the time. I often wonder what people at the time, what sense they could have made of it.
Virginia ratified the Constitution in June of 1788, and New York soon followed. With the support of these two states, the new government moved closer to legitimacy, in spirit as well as in fact.
Our Constitution is in actual operation, and everything appears to promise that it will last. But in this world, nothing can be said to be certain but death and taxes.
Why not have a Bill of Rights? Why not a short document saying our rights are preserved? Are you worried that it'll use up too much paper?
The framers were very skeptical of the value of bills of rights. They'd been attached to many of the early state constitutions, and they hadn't been very effective. They tend to be statements of general principles, which are nice in the abstract. They didn't really establish legally enforceable guarantees. They didn't bind anybody to enforce them. They're just kind of statements of principle.
I affirm that the Bills of Rights are not only unnecessary in the proposed Constitution, but would even be dangerous. For why declare that things shall not be done which there is no power to do?
Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be people to be secure against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be by freedom of speech.
But in 1791, having sifted through over 200 suggestions, Madison presented a Bill of Rights that would be incorporated into the U.S. Constitution as the first 10 amendments.
Madison doesn't think a Bill of Rights is especially useful. He calls them parchment barriers. But Madison comes to believe by late 1788 that enough Americans wrongly are convinced that Bills of Rights are essential. That it would be good to kind of assuage their concerns, their reservations. When he comes over and says, okay, I'll go ahead and support one, is to say that they'll be most effective when people actually internalize them, when they become incorporated in our sentiments. In other words, the real power in our government lies in the people, and the promise to get the people to behave in the right way. So how should a Bill of Rights work? That you and I should read it, and we should understand what it means and how it's supposed to limit the authority of government and also really limit our desires to use government for our own purposes.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America.
I think the Constitution's had an enormous impact on subsequent American history. And I mean, in the first place, how much of our political life requires us to make constitutional arguments in support of the political positions that we want to take. Even when we come out on other sides, or even if we read it in different ways, we're still agreeing on its underlying authority.
It survives so long because it's so short. It allows for plenty of filling in, so to speak, by historical experience. And much of what goes on in our government is not authorized directly, explicitly in the Constitution. It comes out of historical experience. And this makes it work.
You know, it's hard to deny that it's created a fairly effective framework of government that seems to correspond to the political values of the American people. You know, it has all these different institutions, and it's not clear who's accountable to whom, and tends to create gridlock, which drives political scientists and historians nuts, because we like to think government ought to be able to act decisively. But Americans, it turns out, actually tend to like divided government, partly because we don't trust politicians all that much.
The Constitution was the product of heated debate, numerous compromises, ingenious improvisation, and even a bit of luck, all of which resulted in a founding document that was supple but not always entirely clear. In the more than 2 centuries since its adoption, scholars have often disagreed about what the framers actually meant.
We have to do our best to understand what clauses originally meant, but we also have to be careful about not being too arrogant about our ability to make sense of them. So the idea that their intentions, the intentions of a group of people who were themselves going on the basis of experience and experimenting, that their intentions could be locked into a constitutional document and sealed for all time, to me just doesn't make any sense. I mean, I think they would want us to reason on the basis of our experience of what the Constitution itself had proved to mean in practice. We know much more about what the Constitution means because we've seen how it operates than they could ever have understood on the basis of trying to anticipate or expect or even predetermine what it ought to mean.
While disputes over its interpretation can cause deep political rifts, the Constitution remains a unifying symbol.
You don't read the Bible all the time, but you know the Bible is somehow important for some groups of Americans. The same may be true for the Constitution. Many of us may not know precisely what's in there, but we know it's important to begin with, that disputes are settled by returning to the document and seeing whether the document supports our position or not. And so it survives, in a sense, as a symbol of American unity, more so than simply a blueprint for how the government operates.